My name is Donovan Vaughn. I'm a CIA. And 3 days ago, I watched my suburban neighborhood turn into a feeding ground for the infected. For 72 hours, I used every skill the agency taught me to stay alive while uncovering the truth. Behind the zombie outbreak, what I discovered will make you question everything you think you know about who really controls this country. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Donovan Vaughn, and I need you to understand something right from the start. What I'm about to tell you isn't some Hollywood fantasy or government propaganda. This is exactly what happened during the first 72 hours of what the media would later call the Virginia incident. They'll tell you it was a chemical plant explosion that caused mass hallucinations. They'll show you sanitized footage of hazmat teams cleaning up industrial waste. But I was there. I lived through it. And I'm going to tell you the truth because if this ever happens again, you need to know what you're really dealing with. 3 days ago, I was just another ghost in the machine. 18 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, the last 3. Spent deep undercover infiltrating Russian arms networks in Eastern Europe. I just returned to the States 48 hours before everything went sideways, sitting in my Cover Identities rental house in Fairfax County, Virginia, to my neighbors. I was Daniel Morrison, a boring international supply chain consultant who traveled too much and kept to himself. They had no idea I'd spent 3 years convincing some of the most dangerous men in the world that I was a corrupt American businessman willing to facilitate weapons transfers for the right price. The house was perfect suburban camouflage. 2-story. Colonial in a quiet neighborhood, where everyone knew each other's routines but minded their own business. Mrs. Patterson across the street walked her ancient golden retriever at exactly 7:15 every morning. The Johnsons next door had their newspaper delivered at 6:30 and their coffee brewing by 6:45. I'd memorized these patterns during my brief stays between overseas assignments because in my line of work, knowing what's normal is the first step to spotting what's not. That morning started like any other. October 15th, 6:47 in the morning, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was still steaming, scrolling through encrypted messages on my secure phone. The autumn air was crisp enough that I'd cracked the window to let in some fresh air. Everything was peaceful, ordinary, exactly what I needed after 3 years of looking over my shoulder in Moscow hotel rooms. Then the emergency broadcast cut through the morning, quiet like a knife. The robotic voice was calm, professional, the kind of tone they use when they don't want to cause panic, but need to deliver serious information. It spoke of a rapidly spreading illness affecting residents throughout Northern Virginia. Citizens were advised to remain indoors and await further instructions from local authorities. All non-essential travel was suspended immediately. Anyone experiencing symptoms of aggressive behavior or disorientation should contact emergency services immediately. Now I've heard a lot of government speak in my career. I know the difference between standard crisis management language and the kind of carefully chosen words they use when they're trying not to cause mass hysteria. This was the latter. The phrase rapidly spreading illness combined with aggressive behavior sent up red flags immediately. Diseases don't usually make people aggressive unless we're talking about something that affects brain function. And when the government starts talking about brain-affecting pathogens, you're either dealing with a chemical weapon or something biological that was never meant to see daylight. I was reaching for my secure phone to contact my handler, Sarah Chun, when I heard the first screams. They came from outside, somewhere down the street. Not the kind of screams you hear during accidents or medical emergencies. These were different, raw, primal, the kind of sounds people make when they're being hunted. I moved to the front window and looked out at what should have been a typical suburban morning. Mrs. Patterson was stumbling out of her front door, but something was fundamentally wrong with the way she moved. She lurched forward in jerky, unnatural motions, like a marionette being operated by someone who'd never used strings before. Her nightgown was torn and stained with what looked like blood, dark patches that hadn't been there during her usual morning routine. When she turned toward my house, I got a clear look in her face. Her jaw hung at an impossible angle, like it had been dislocated or broken. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that reminded me of corpses I'd seen in war zones. But it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. They'd turned completely white, not the cloudy white of cataracts, but something else entirely. Something that looked like milk poured over glass. And despite those dead eyes, she was looking directly at me with an intensity that suggested she could see perfectly well. Then she started running. Not the careful shuffle you'd expect from someone clearly injured, but a full sprint. Her broken jaw bounced with each step, but she didn't seem to feel any pain. She crossed the street in seconds, heading straight for my front door with single-minded determination. I grabbed my Glock from the kitchen drawer where I kept it as part of my standard operational security and moved to get a better view. Mrs. Patterson slammed into my front door with enough force to rattle the frame. The sound was wet and meaty, like a side of beef being thrown against a wall. But instead of backing away or showing any sign that the impact had hurt her, she immediately began clawing at the wood with her fingernails. The scratching sound was horrible, nails being torn away from fingertips as she scraped at the door like an animal trying to dig its way into a burrow. The sound she made wasn't human. It was a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. But underneath that moan was something else, something that sounded almost like hunger, like she was anticipating a meal and couldn't wait to begin eating. That's when my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The number was listed as unknown, but the message made my heart stop. "They're not sick, they're dead. Trust nitrogen monoxide 1. Sarah." My handler was alive, but the implications of her message were staggering. She was telling me that Mrs. Patterson wasn't suffering from some exotic disease. She was telling me that my elderly neighbor was dead, but somehow still moving, still hunting, still trying to get into my house for reasons I didn't want to contemplate. Sarah Chun had been my handler for 8 years. She was the most level-headed, analytical person I'd ever worked with. During my deep cover assignment, she'd been my lifeline to sanity, the voice of reason that kept me grounded when I had to pretend to be someone I wasn't for months at a time. Sarah didn't panic. She didn't exaggerate. And she sure as hell didn't break communication protocols unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. The last time she'd used an unsecured channel to contact me was in Prague, 3 years ago, when we discovered that the arms deal I was supposed to infiltrate was actually a cover for something much worse. That time, her warning had saved my life and prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds of people. If she was breaking protocol now, it meant the situation was beyond anything we'd trained for. I looked back out the window and felt my training kick in. Instead of panicking, I started gathering intelligence. Mrs. Patterson was still clawing at my door, but she wasn't the only problem anymore. Across the street, I could see more neighbors emerging from their houses. Mr. Jenkins from 2 doors down was stumbling across his lawn with the same jerky, unnatural gait. The teenage kid who delivered newspapers was standing in the middle of the street, swaying back and forth like he was listening to music only he could hear. But they all had the same characteristics: the grayish skin, the milky white eyes, the apparent lack of pain response. And they were all moving with purpose, like they were hunting for something specific. I counted 7 of them within my immediate line of sight, and more were appearing every few minutes. Whatever was happening, it was spreading fast. Too fast for any natural disease process. In 18 years of intelligence work, I'd seen biological weapons, chemical attacks, and every kind of exotic pathogen you could imagine. None of them worked this quickly or produced these specific symptoms. This was engineered. The thought hit me like a physical blow. Someone had created this. Someone had designed a pathogen that could kill people and then reanimate their bodies as hunting machines. And they deployed it in my neighborhood during the brief window when I was back in the country between assignments. That couldn't be a coincidence. I pulled out my secure phone and tried to contact Sarah directly, but the call went straight to voicemail. The cellular networks were either overloaded or had been deliberately disrupted. I tried the backup communication protocols we'd established for emergency situations, but those channels were silent too. Whatever was happening, it was big enough to disrupt government communications. I moved through the house systematically, checking all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked and secure. The scratching at my front door had been joined by similar sounds from other directions. More of them were gathering around my house, drawn by some instinct I didn't understand. Through the back window, I could see the Johnsons stumbling around their backyard. Their golden retriever was lying motionless on the grass, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. That detail stuck with me. Animals were dying too, but they weren't coming back. Whatever was affecting humans specifically, it was designed to work only on us. That level of biological specificity required advanced genetic engineering and a deep understanding of human physiology. This wasn't some naturally occurring virus that had mutated. This was a weapon, and it was being field tested in my neighborhood. I went to my home office and opened the safe where I kept my emergency supplies. 18 years in the intelligence community teaches you to always have backup plans for backup plans. Inside were 3 fake passports, $50,000 in various currencies, ammunition for my sidearm, a satellite phone with encrypted communication capabilities, and a go bag containing survival gear for 72 hours. But as I looked at these preparations, I realized how useless they were in this situation. My emergency protocols were designed around the assumption that government infrastructure would still exist, that I could contact my handlers, access safe houses, or exfiltrate through established networks. None of those assumptions applied when the government might be part of the problem. The satellite phone showed no available networks. The encrypted channels were silent. Even the emergency frequencies used by federal agencies were broadcasting nothing but static. Either the entire eastern seaboard had gone dark, or someone was jamming communications across multiple spectrums simultaneously. By noon, I'd counted 17 neighbors who'd undergone the same transformation. The speed was all wrong. Natural diseases don't spread like this. Even engineered biological weapons take time to incubate, to spread through a population, to manifest symptoms. But this was happening in real time, like someone had flipped a switch and activated something that was already in place. I started thinking about everything I'd consumed in the past 48 hours. The coffee this morning came from beans I'd bought myself. The water was from the municipal supply, but so was everyone else's. The air conditioning had been running, pulling in outside air. If this was a deployment, it could have been airborne, waterborne, or even introduced through the food supply weeks ago and activated by some kind of trigger signal. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this was a controlled test. Someone wanted to see how their weapon performed in a real-world environment. They'd chosen a suburban neighborhood with a specific demographic profile, introduced their pathogen through some vector that affected the entire population simultaneously, and now they were collecting data on the results, which meant they were watching. That realization made me start thinking about surveillance. I began moving more carefully through the house, staying away from windows, avoiding predictable patterns. If this was a test, then I was either a test subject who was supposed to succumb to the pathogen, or I was a control subject who was meant to remain unaffected so they could study the differences. Neither possibility was comforting. Around 2 in the afternoon, the power went out. It wasn't a gradual brownout or the kind of rolling blackout you get during peak demand periods. One moment the air conditioning was humming and the refrigerator was running. The next moment everything went silent. I checked the breaker box, but the problem wasn't in my house. Through the windows, I could see that the entire neighborhood had gone dark. Losing power during a biological crisis isn't just inconvenient, it's catastrophic. No power means no refrigeration for medicines, no air filtration systems, no communication networks, no emergency services. It also means no street lights, no security systems, and no way to coordinate response efforts. If this was deliberate, it was designed to maximize chaos and prevent organized resistance. I had maybe 6 hours of daylight left, and then I'd be trapped in a dark house surrounded by infected neighbors who seemed to be getting more aggressive as time went on. The scratching at my doors had become more intense, more coordinated. They were learning, adapting their behavior based on what wasn't working. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 72 hours. I couldn't stay in the house. The emergency supplies I'd stockpiled were useful for temporary situations, but this wasn't temporary. This was the beginning of something much larger, and I needed to start thinking like an intelligence operative instead of like a civilian trying to wait out a crisis. I needed information. I needed to understand the scope of what was happening, who was responsible, and what their ultimate objectives were. Most importantly, I needed to find Sarah Chun and figure out why she'd risked breaking communication protocols to warn me. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for mobility. I loaded my go bag with everything I might need for extended operations in a hostile environment. Extra ammunition, water purification tablets, high-energy food that wouldn't require cooking, basic medical supplies, and the portable electronics that might help me re-establish communication with whoever was left of my support network. But I also packed things that weren't in any standard survival kit. Lockpicks, because normal rules about private property wouldn't apply anymore. A portable scanner that could intercept radio transmissions, because understanding enemy communications would be crucial. Chemical testing strips that could detect biological and chemical weapons, because I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. As the sun started to set, I could see more infected gathering in the street outside my house. They moved in loose groups now, not quite coordinated, but definitely exhibiting pack behavior. When one of them detected something interesting, the others would converge on the same area. They were communicating somehow, sharing information through means I couldn't detect. That behavior pattern reminded me of something I'd seen in classified reports about experimental military research. There'd been rumors for years about programs designed to create enhanced soldiers who could operate as hive minds, sharing tactical information instantaneously across a battlefield. What if someone had taken that research in a different direction? What if instead of enhancing living soldiers, they'd found a way to create disposable armies from the dead? The implications were staggering. An enemy who could turn your own population against you, who could create unlimited soldiers who felt no pain and had no fear, who could deploy their weapon anywhere in the world without detection until it was too late to respond. But there was something else bothering me about the situation. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on until I was packing my emergency communication equipment. Their phone was still ringing when I found them. I'm talking about the Johnsons, my next-door neighbors. I'd watched them turn into those things hours ago. Watched them kill their own dog. Watched them join the pack that was now surrounding my house. But through the thin walls, I could hear their landline phone ringing over and over again. Someone kept calling back, letting it ring exactly 12 times before hanging up, then calling again 5 minutes later. In the middle of an apocalypse, who keeps trying to reach a dead family with that kind of precision and persistence? The pattern was too regular to be coincidental. 12 rings, 5-minute intervals, over and over for hours. That wasn't someone desperately trying to reach loved ones. That was a signal. Someone was using the Johnsons' phone line to communicate information, And they were doing it in a way that suggested they knew exactly what had happened to the Johnson family, which meant someone was monitoring the situation in real time. Someone knew that the Johnsons were dead, but was still using their phone line for operational purposes. Someone who had anticipated this outcome and planned for it. As darkness fell over Fairfax County, I realized that everything I thought I knew about the situation was probably wrong. This wasn't a random outbreak or a terrorist attack or even a foreign weapons test. This was something much more sophisticated, much more calculated, and somehow I was part of it. The secure phone I'd been carrying buzzed with another message from Sarah. This time it was longer, more detailed, and infinitely more terrifying. Moscow mission compromised from beginning. You were transporting components, not stopping them. They have been planning this for 3 years. Get to Rally Point Bravo immediately. Phoenix Protocol is active. Trust absolutely no one until we meet face to face. The neighborhood was chosen specifically because you were there. This is not random. Essa. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. My 3-year deep cover mission in Russia, infiltrating arms dealers and weapons manufacturers, hadn't been about stopping illegal sales. I'd been an unwitting courier, helping transport components for the very weapon that was now being tested in my backyard. Rally Point Bravo was a CIA safe house in Arlington, about 20 minutes away under normal circumstances. But with the roads potentially full of infected and emergency services completely dark, it might as well have been on the other side of the world. Phoenix Protocol was something I'd heard whispered about in classified briefings but never seen implemented. It was the designation for operations so sensitive that they required complete communications blackout and total deniability. If Phoenix Protocol was active, it meant that official channels had been compromised and that agents were operating without backup or support from the agency. But it was the last part of Sarah's message that made my blood run cold. The neighborhood was chosen specifically because I was there. This wasn't a random test site or a target of opportunity. Someone had planned this deployment around my presence, which meant they knew exactly who I was and what I'd been doing for the past 3 years. I'd been burned. My cover was blown, my mission was compromised, and now I was trapped in the middle of a biological weapons test that had been designed specifically to include me as either a target or a test subject. Outside, the infected were becoming more active as darkness fell. I could hear them moving around the house, testing different entry points, learning the layout of my defenses. Soon they would find a way in, or more would arrive, and they'd simply overwhelm my barriers through sheer numbers. I had to move tonight. Waiting until morning would mean facing daylight travel through unknown territory with infected who'd had all night to spread throughout the area. Better to travel in darkness, using the concealment to avoid large groups while I made my way to the safe house where Sarah was hopefully waiting with answers. But first, I needed to understand what I was really dealing with. I needed to know if this pathogen could affect me, if there were ways to avoid infection, and most importantly, if there was any way to reverse what had happened to my neighbors. I opened my laptop and started accessing the classified databases I still had clearance to use, hoping the internet connection would hold long enough to download critical information about biological weapons and emergency response protocols. What I found in those files would change everything I thought I knew about my government, my mission, and my own role in the events that were about to reshape the world. But that's a story for what happened next when I discovered that sometimes the people who claim they're trying to save you are actually the ones you need to fear most. The classified files I accessed that night painted a picture I wasn't prepared for. Buried in subsections of biological warfare research dating back to the Cold War were references to something called Project Lazarus. The documentation was heavily redacted, but what I could piece together suggested that both the Soviet Union and the United States had been working on weaponized pathogens that could reanimate dead tissue for military purposes. The research had supposedly been terminated in 1987 under international treaty obligations, but the files I was looking at had timestamps from just 6 months ago. Someone had been continuing this research in secret, and based on what I was seeing outside my windows, they'd perfected it. By 3 in the morning, I downloaded everything I could access before the internet connection finally died completely. The information was fragmentary but disturbing. References to test sites, population studies, deployment vectors, and something called Phase 2 implementation that was mentioned repeatedly without explanation. Most troubling were the personnel files I'd managed to access. Names of researchers, military contractors, and government officials who'd been involved in the original Lazarus project were now showing up in connection with something called Meridian Solutions, a private defense contractor I'd never heard of. But I had heard one of those names before, Dr. Elizabeth Kane had been referenced in documents I'd photographed during my Moscow assignment, though at the time I'd assumed she was just another arms dealer making connections with Eastern European weapons manufacturers. Now I was looking at her actual resume, and she wasn't a dealer at all. She was a microbiologist specializing in pathogen weaponization, and according to these files, she'd been leading Project Lazarus research for the past 5 years. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways that made me physically sick. My 3-year mission infiltrating Russian arms networks hadn't been about stopping weapons sales. I'd been photographing research documents, tracking financial transfers, and establishing relationships with people who were actually working for the same organization that had just deployed a biological weapon in my neighborhood. I'd been an unwitting asset helping them perfect their research. Dawn was approaching, and I could see through the windows that more infected had gathered during the night. The street was now completely overrun with them, at least 40 or 50 moving in loose coordination patterns that suggested they were developing more sophisticated hunting behaviors. They'd stopped trying to get into my house and instead seemed to be waiting for something. That change in behavior was ominous. Either they'd learned that my house was too well defended to be worth the effort, or they were following instructions from some kind of central coordination system. I needed to move while I still could. Rally Point Bravo was my only connection to answers, and Sarah was the only person I could trust to tell me the truth about what was really happening. But getting there meant crossing 20 miles of potentially hostile territory, while avoiding both the infected and whatever government response teams might be operating in the area. I loaded my gear into a tactical backpack and prepared to leave through the basement window that faced away from the street. The infected seemed to be primarily visual hunters, responding to movement and sound, so staying low and moving carefully might let me slip past them undetected. But first, I needed transportation. My car was parked in the driveway, completely surrounded by infected. Even if I could reach it, starting the engine would draw every one of them in the area directly to me. That's when I remembered the Hendersons. 3 houses down. They'd been traveling when this started, which meant their house was probably empty and their car might still be in their garage. If I could get there without being detected, I might have a vehicle and a temporary safe location to plan my next moves. Moving through suburban neighborhoods at dawn while avoiding infected turned out to be a masterclass in urban warfare techniques I'd learned in places like Fallujah and Kandahar, but never expected to use in Virginia. Every shadow could hide a threat, every sound could draw unwanted attention, and every decision about which route to take could mean the difference between reaching my objective and becoming another casualty. The infected moved differently in daylight. They were more active, more responsive to their environment, but also more predictable. They seemed to hunt primarily by sight and sound, which meant that careful movement and noise discipline could keep me undetected. What worried me more was their coordination. They moved in groups now, with some individuals acting as scouts while others waited in concealment. That level of tactical behavior suggested either retained intelligence or some kind of external control system. I reached the Henderson house after 40 minutes of careful movement, slipping through backyards and using landscaping for concealment. The house was dark and quiet, exactly what I'd hoped for. The garage door was unlocked, and inside was a Honda Civic that looked like it hadn't been driven in several days. The keys were hanging on a hook next to the door, because even in the intelligence community, some people are trusting enough to make operational security mistakes. But as I was preparing to take the car, I heard voices coming from inside the house, human voices. People talking in low, urgent tones about supplies and safety and plans for getting out of the area. Other survivors who'd had the same idea I'd had about using the Henderson house as a temporary refuge. The question was whether they were genuine civilians trying to survive or something else entirely. In my line of work, you learn to be paranoid about coincidences. Finding other survivors in the exact house I'd chosen as a staging point could be legitimate bad luck, or it could be evidence that someone was predicting my movements and positioning assets accordingly. But I needed information about what was happening in the wider area, and these people might have knowledge I could use. I approached the house carefully, using techniques I'd learned for making contact with potentially hostile assets in foreign territories. I needed to assess the situation without revealing my own capabilities or intentions until I was sure about who I was dealing with. There were 4 of them. A woman in scrubs who introduced herself as Janet, claiming to be a nurse from the local hospital. A security guard named Marcus who said he'd been working at the shopping center when everything started. A elementary school teacher called Lisa who'd been trapped at the school overnight. And a man named Tom who claimed to be an accountant, but had the bearing and mannerisms of someone with military or law enforcement training. Janet seemed genuinely concerned about the medical implications of what we were dealing with. She described symptoms she'd observed in patients during the early stages of the outbreak before the hospital had been evacuated. According to her, the transformation process took approximately 4 to 6 hours from initial infection to complete reanimation. The pathogen appeared to be transmitted through fluid contact, primarily saliva or blood, but she wasn't certain. About airborne transmission vectors, Marcus had practical information about the spread pattern throughout the local area. The shopping center had been overrun within hours of the first cases appearing, but the infection seemed to be concentrated in residential areas rather than commercial districts. That suggested either a targeted deployment or a transmission vector that was more effective in home environments. Lisa provided details about emergency response efforts. She'd been in contact with other teachers and school administrators throughout the county before communications went down, and the reports she'd received suggested that this was happening simultaneously across multiple school districts. The infection wasn't spreading outward from a single point of origin. It was appearing in multiple locations at once, which confirmed my suspicions about coordinated deployment. But it was Tom who made me most suspicious. He claimed to be an accountant, but his hands had calluses in places that indicated regular weapons training. He knew military radio protocols and used tactical terminology that most civilians wouldn't be familiar with. When he talked about potential evacuation routes, he described them in terms of defensible positions and fields of fire rather than simple travel logistics. I'd seen those behavioral patterns before, in military contractors working in Afghanistan and Iraq. Tom wasn't an accountant. He was either active military, former special operations, or working for a government agency in some capacity. The question was whether he was there to help us or to monitor us. We spent the morning sharing information and planning our next moves. The group wanted to head south toward Richmond, believing that larger cities would have better organized emergency response capabilities. I didn't disagree with their logic, but I had my own agenda. I needed to reach the CIA safe house in Arlington, and I couldn't explain that objective without revealing my own background. So I convinced them that heading north toward Washington made more sense. I argued that federal emergency response would be coordinated from the capital region, and that we'd be more likely to find government assistance there than in Richmond. It wasn't entirely a lie, just a careful shaping of the truth to serve my operational requirements. We decided to travel together as far as the Arlington area, where our paths would naturally diverge based on our different objectives. Having a group would provide additional security and cover for movement, while giving me opportunities to gather more intelligence about what Tom was really doing and whether any of the others had information they weren't sharing. But first, we needed supplies. The Henderson house had some food and water, but not enough for 4 people traveling an unknown distance through potentially hostile territory. Marcus suggested hitting the shopping center where he'd worked since he knew the layout and could guide us to the most useful resources. The Fairfax Corner Shopping Center was a different world from the suburban neighborhood where I'd spent the night. Where the residential areas had been overrun with infected, the commercial district seemed almost abandoned. There were signs of hasty evacuation, scattered personal belongings, and damaged storefronts, but very few of the infected themselves. Marcus led us through employee entrances he had keys for, avoiding the main corridors where we might be more visible to anyone. Watching the area, we split up to cover more ground efficiently, with each person responsible for gathering specific types of supplies. Janet focused on medical equipment and pharmaceuticals from the CVS. Lisa collected non-perishable food from the grocery store. Marcus gathered tools and hardware from the Sears. I went after electronics and communication equipment from the Best Buy. But what I really wanted was access to the security office, where I could review surveillance footage from the past 48 hours and potentially identify patterns in how the infection had spread through the area. What I found in those security recordings changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. The footage showed the shopping center during normal business hours on October 14th, the day before the outbreak began. Everything looked completely routine until approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, when an unmarked van pulled up to the loading dock behind the grocery store. 2 men in hazmat suits unloaded several cylindrical containers and connected them to the building's ventilation system. They worked for exactly 18 minutes, then packed up their equipment and left. 6 hours later, the first infected appeared in the parking lot. This wasn't a random outbreak or a terrorist attack using stolen biological weapons. This was a coordinated deployment by people with advanced knowledge of building systems and emergency response protocols. The timing, the equipment, the systematic approach to contamination, everything indicated professional operational planning. But what made my blood run cold was recognizing one of the faces on the security footage. When the man in the hazmat suit turned toward the camera for just a moment, I got a clear view of his features. I'd seen that face before, in classified briefings about military contractors working on sensitive government projects. He worked for Meridian Solutions, the same company that had been funding research into weaponized pathogens. The same company whose personnel files I'd accessed the night before. The same company that Dr. Elizabeth Kane had been working for, when she'd perfected the technology that was now turning my neighbors into hunting machines. I was looking at proof that this outbreak was a deliberate deployment by a defense contractor with connections to classified government research programs. But I was also looking at evidence that someone had anticipated my presence in the area and had planned the deployment accordingly. The timestamp on the footage showed that the contamination had been introduced while I was still in my house, completely unaware that I was about to become part of a biological weapons test. Someone had known exactly where I would be and when I would be there. Someone had been tracking my movements and planning this operation around my location. I copied the footage to a portable drive and rejoined the others, not mentioning what I'd discovered. If Tom was really working for a government agency, I needed to know which one and what his actual mission was before revealing that I had evidence of government involvement in the outbreak. We left the shopping center with enough supplies to last several days, but I could tell that the group dynamics were starting to shift. Tom was asking too many questions about my background and seemed particularly interested in my knowledge of emergency procedures. Janet was displaying medical expertise that seemed more advanced than what you'd expect from a typical hospital nurse. Even Lisa seemed to know more about emergency communications than an elementary school teacher should. I was starting to suspect that none of us were exactly who we claimed to be. The drive north toward Arlington took us through areas where the infection had spread in patterns that confirmed my worst fears. It wasn't random. It wasn't spreading outward from single points of origin. It was appearing simultaneously in multiple locations, always in residential areas, always in communities that fit specific demographic profiles. Someone was conducting a controlled field test of a biological weapon, and they were gathering data on how effectively it could disable civilian populations in different types of environments. The outbreak in Fairfax County wasn't an attack. It was research. And somehow, all four of us had ended up together despite having completely different starting points and objectives. That level of coincidence doesn't happen naturally in operational environments. Someone was orchestrating our movements, bringing us together for reasons I didn't understand yet. As we approached the Arlington area where I hoped to find Sarah at Rally Point Bravo, Tom finally revealed what I'd been suspecting all along. He wasn't an accountant. He was NSA, part of a rapid response team that had been deployed to assess and contain the outbreak. But instead of being relieved to discover that government resources were still operational, I felt a chill run down my spine. Because if the NSA was involved in containment operations, and if they'd positioned an asset in our survivor group, it meant they'd known about the outbreak before it happened. It meant they were part of whatever was really going on. Tom smiled when he saw the recognition in my eyes. "We've been watching you since Moscow, Vaughn," he said, using my real name for the first time. "The question is, are you still loyal to your country or just to yourself?" That's when I realized that getting to Rally Point Bravo wasn't going to solve my problems. It was going to create entirely new ones. Because if Tom knew who I really was, and if he'd been positioned to monitor me, then whoever was behind this outbreak had been planning it around my involvement from the very beginning. The safe house I was heading toward might not be safe at all. It might be exactly where they wanted me to go. But I was already committed to the route, and Sarah was the only person who might have answers about what my Moscow mission had really accomplished. I had to take the risk, even knowing it might be a trap. What I didn't know yet was that the trap had already been sprung, and I'd been walking into it from the moment I decided to leave my house the night before. The drive to Arlington became a psychological chess match with Tom, each of us probing for information while trying not to reveal how much we actually knew. He'd blown my cover by using my real name, but he was still pretending to be part of a containment operation rather than acknowledging whatever his real mission was. Janet and Lisa had gone quiet, which suggested they understood that the dynamic in our group had shifted into something more dangerous. Rally Point Bravo was a CIA safe house disguised as a small accounting firm in a nondescript office building near Reagan National Airport. I'd been there twice during my career for emergency debriefings, and it was one of the few locations where I was certain I could access secure communications and potentially re-establish contact with my handlers. But as we approached the Arlington area, I started noticing surveillance patterns that suggested the location was being watched. There were too many maintenance vehicles parked on side streets with clear sight lines to the building. Too many people in business attire walking routes that didn't make sense for the area. Too many cars with government plates positioned at strategic intersections. Either the safe house was being protected by friendly forces, or it was being monitored by people who wanted to see who showed up there. I made the decision to approach the building alone, leaving the others at a coffee shop 6 blocks away with instructions to wait exactly 2 hours before assuming something had gone wrong. Tom objected to the separation, claiming that we were safer traveling as a group, but I insisted that reconnaissance required a smaller footprint. What I didn't tell him was that I wanted to test whether my arrival at the safe house would trigger any kind of response from the surveillance teams I'd identified. The accounting office looked exactly as it should from the outside. Professional signage, generic office furniture visible through the windows, the kind of boring facade that discourages curiosity. But when I used my access codes to enter through the rear service entrance, I found a scene that made my blood run cold. The safe house had been stripped clean. Not just evacuated, but systematically dismantled. Every piece of electronic equipment had been removed. Every document had been shredded. Every communication device had been destroyed. But whoever had done this work had been in a hurry, because they'd left behind fragments of what they'd been trying to hide. I found pieces of burned paper in the industrial shredder that contained partial serial numbers matching components I'd photographed during my Moscow mission. I found equipment inventory lists that referenced the same Meridian Solutions company whose personnel I'd seen on the shopping center security footage. Most importantly, I found fragments of a personnel file with my photograph and details about my assignment history going back 5 years. Someone had been tracking my career and planning operations around my movements for much longer than I'd realized. The Moscow mission hadn't just been compromised. It had been designed from the beginning to position me exactly where they needed me to be for this biological weapons test. That's when I found Sarah's video message. Hidden in a concealed compartment behind a false wall panel was a secure tablet that had been programmed to activate only when someone with my biometric signature entered the building. The message was time-stamped 18 hours earlier, which meant Sarah had recorded it after the outbreak began, but before communications had gone completely dark. She looked terrified, and I'd never seen Sarah scared of anything in 8 years of working together. Dex, if you're watching this, it means you made it out of the initial deployment zone and you're still thinking like an operative instead of a victim. That's good, because what I'm about to tell you is going to challenge everything you believe about your service to this country. She paused to look directly into the camera, and I could see exhaustion and something else in her eyes. Guilt, maybe. Or the kind of moral fatigue that comes from discovering that everything you've worked for has been corrupted. The Moscow mission was never about stopping arms dealers. You were identifying and cataloging components for a biological weapons program that's been in development for over a decade. Every photograph you took, every contact you made, every piece of intelligence you gathered was helping Meridian Solutions perfect their pathogen delivery systems. The implications hit me like a physical blow. 3 years of my life, 3 years of maintaining a cover identity and risking my life to infiltrate criminal networks, had actually been spent helping the enemy perfect the weapon they'd just deployed against American civilians. The outbreak in Virginia isn't random, and it isn't the full scope of their operation. According to the intelligence I've been able to gather, Virginia is a beta test. The real deployment is scheduled for tomorrow night, simultaneous releases in 12 major metropolitan areas across the country. They're calling it Phase 2 implementation. Sarah held up a data drive, the same kind we used for transferring classified information between secure systems. Everything I know about the program is on this drive, including the locations of the planned deployments and the identity of everyone involved in the operation. But Dex, you need to understand something crucial. This isn't a foreign attack. This is being conducted by American defense contractors with approval from elements within our own government. She leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to a whisper. They've been planning this for years, and they've been using operatives like you and me to gather the intelligence they needed. We thought we were serving our country, but we were actually helping them develop the capability to destroy it. The video continued with technical details about the pathogen, information about Meridian Solutions research facilities, and a list of government officials who were involved in the program. But it was the final part of her message that made me understand the true scope of what I was dealing with. I'm going underground, but I'll try to maintain contact through the emergency protocols we established. If something happens to me, the drive contains everything you need to stop Phase 2. But Dex, you need to know that by the time you're watching this, they already know you have access to this information. The safe house is compromised, and they're using you to test their containment protocols. She looked directly into the camera one last time. Trust absolutely no one. The people who claim they're trying to help you are probably the ones you need to fear most. And remember, the only way to stop this is to make sure everyone knows the truth. The video ended, leaving me alone in a stripped safe house with the knowledge that I'd been an unwitting participant in developing the biological weapon that was now being tested on American soil. But more immediately, I was trapped in a location that was being monitored by people who wanted to see how I'd react to learning the truth about my mission. I found the data drive hidden exactly where Sarah had indicated, concealed behind a false panel in the emergency communication equipment. The drive was encrypted with protocols I recognized, but accessing the information would require equipment I didn't have with me. I needed to get back to the others and find a location where I could properly analyze what Sarah had discovered. But as I prepared to leave the safe house, I realized that the surveillance teams I'd noticed earlier were no longer maintaining concealment. They were closing in on the building, and I could hear vehicles moving into position around all the exits. I'd walked into exactly the trap Sarah had warned me about. The emergency egress routes I'd memorized during my previous visits to the safe house were all being covered by what appeared to be federal tactical teams. These weren't local police or even FBI, based on their equipment and movement patterns. They were military or intelligence community assets conducting a precision operation. I had maybe minutes before they breached the building, and I needed to get out with the data drive while avoiding capture by people who were probably authorized to use lethal force to protect their operation. The problem was that all the standard escape routes were compromised, which meant I needed to improvise using techniques I'd learned during my time in hostile territories overseas. The building's HVAC system provided access to the roof, but getting there required crawling through ductwork that hadn't been designed for human movement. It was claustrophobic, uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous if the ducts couldn't support my weight. But it was the only route that wouldn't lead directly into the arms of the people who were trying to capture me. I made it to the roof just as the tactical teams breached the ground floor entrances. From my elevated position, I could see the scope of the operation they'd mounted. At least 6 vehicles, 24 personnel, and equipment that suggested they were prepared for extended surveillance and potential armed resistance. This wasn't a casual monitoring operation. This was a major resource commitment designed to ensure that whoever entered the safe house would not leave with the information Sarah had hidden there. But they'd made one critical mistake in their planning. They'd positioned their assets to cover the building exits, but they hadn't adequately secured the neighboring structures. The roof I was on connected to an adjacent office building through a maintenance walkway. And from there, I could access a completely different street that wasn't part of their perimeter. Getting off the roof and back to street level required rappelling down the side of the adjacent building using emergency fire equipment, but I'd done similar extractions in much more hostile environments. The challenge was doing it without being spotted by any surveillance assets they might have positioned to watch the wider area. 20 minutes after entering the safe house, I was walking away from it through a route that should have been invisible to their monitoring systems. But I was also carrying information that people were willing to kill to protect, and I had no way of knowing how far their operational reach extended. I made it back to the coffee shop where I'd left the others, but the dynamic of our group had changed completely during my absence. Tom was no longer pretending to be a helpful government asset. He was openly coordinating with someone via encrypted radio, using protocols that I recognized from joint operations between the CIA and NSA. Janet had abandoned any pretense of being a civilian nurse. She was discussing pathogen characteristics and transmission vectors with a level of technical expertise that suggested advanced training in biological warfare. When she saw me approaching, she immediately stopped talking and tried to look like she'd been making casual conversation about medical supplies. Lisa was the only one who seemed genuinely relieved to see me return, but even she was asking questions that suggested she knew more about our situation than an elementary school teacher should. She wanted to know if I'd been able to establish contact with emergency services, if I'd found evidence about the scope of the outbreak, and whether there were evacuation routes that might be safer than the ones we'd been considering. I realized that none of them were who they'd claimed to be, and our meeting at the Henderson house hadn't been coincidental. We'd been brought together as part of some kind of operational test, with each of us playing roles that were designed to elicit specific responses from the others. Tom confirmed my suspicions when he approached me directly, no longer bothering to maintain his cover identity. "You found the drive," he said. "It wasn't a question. The question now is whether you're going to cooperate with the containment operation or whether we need to treat you as a security threat." I looked at Janet and Lisa, trying to determine whether they were part of Tom's team or whether they had their own agendas. Janet was watching our conversation with the kind of professional interest that suggested she was evaluating my psychological state for signs of breakdown or resistance. Lisa was positioning herself near the exit, ready to either flee or prevent my escape depending on how the situation developed. "You want to tell me what containment operation you're referring to?" I asked, playing for time while I assessed my options. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're all part of whatever deployed that biological weapon in the first place." Tom smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the kind of smile people use when they're about to reveal information that will fundamentally change your understanding of a situation. "The pathogen deployment was a controlled field test," he said. "We needed to evaluate the effectiveness of our countermeasures under realistic conditions. The Virginia Outbreak was designed to simulate enemy deployment scenarios so we could test our response capabilities." The casual way he described the deaths of thousands of people as a simulation made me understand that I was dealing with people who'd completely separated themselves from normal moral constraints. They weren't trying to protect the country. They were treating American citizens as expendable test subjects in their development of biological warfare capabilities. Janet is Dr. Janet Morrison, senior researcher with the Centers for Disease Control's Biological Defense Division. She's been documenting pathogen behavior and effectiveness metrics throughout the test period. Lisa is Agent Lisa Chun, an SA intelligence analyst specializing in population response patterns during crisis situations. She's been gathering data on civilian reaction protocols and evacuation behaviors. He paused to let that information sink in, watching my face for signs of how I was processing the revelation that I'd been surrounded by government assets from the moment I'd left my house. "And you, Donovan Vaughn, are the unwitting test subject, whose behavior we've been studying to evaluate the effectiveness of our operational security protocols. Every decision you've made, every route you've chosen, every person you've trusted has been part of a controlled experiment designed to identify vulnerabilities in our containment procedures. The scope of their manipulation was staggering. They used my own survival instincts and professional training against me, turning my attempts to escape their biological weapons test into data points for improving their operational effectiveness. But they'd made one crucial error in their planning. They'd assumed that learning the truth about their operation would break my resistance and make me willing to cooperate with their agenda. Instead, it confirmed everything Sarah had warned. me about and strengthened my resolve to stop Phase 2 implementation. Before they could deploy their weapon in 12 major cities, I still had the data drive Sarah had hidden for me, and they didn't know I'd successfully retrieved it. As long as I could keep that information secret, I had a chance to expose their operation and prevent the nationwide deployment they were planning. The challenge was getting away from 3 trained operatives in a public location without revealing that I had the intelligence they were trying to protect. I needed to convince them that I was willing to cooperate while actually planning my escape and the exposure of their conspiracy. So what happens now? I asked, trying to project the kind of resigned acceptance they'd expect from someone who just learned they'd been completely outmaneuvered. Tom's smile became genuinely pleased, like he was congratulating a student who'd finally understood a difficult lesson. Now you help us complete the field test by documenting your observations about pathogen behavior and survival strategies. Your intelligence background makes you uniquely qualified to provide the kind of tactical assessment we need for our final evaluation. What he was really saying was that they wanted me to help them perfect their biological weapon by sharing everything I'd learned about surviving its deployment. They wanted me to become an active participant in developing the tools they planned to use against American cities. But what Tom didn't realize was that I'd already made my choice about which side I was on, and it wasn't theirs. I agreed to cooperate with their debriefing process, knowing that it would give me time to plan my next moves while maintaining access to their operational information. But I was also planning something they wouldn't expect from a cooperative test subject. I was going to use their own security protocols against them, expose their conspiracy to the American people, and make sure that Sarah Chun's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. The real war was just beginning, and they'd made the mistake of teaching me exactly who the enemy was. The debriefing session they conducted felt more like an interrogation designed to extract every detail of my survival strategies so they could improve their biological weapons' effectiveness. Tom, Janet, and Lisa took turns asking questions about my decision-making process, my assessment of the infected's behavioral patterns, and my evaluation of potential countermeasures that civilian populations might develop in response to deployment. They were particularly interested in my observations about the infected's coordination capabilities and learning behaviors. Janet wanted detailed descriptions of how they'd adapted their hunting strategies over time, while Lisa focused on communication patterns I'd noticed between different groups. Tom kept pushing for tactical assessments about which survival strategies had been most effective and which had failed completely. What disturbed me most was how clinically they approached the discussion. They talked about the deaths of my neighbors, the destruction of entire communities, and the terror experienced by thousands of innocent people as if they were reviewing data from a computer simulation. These weren't enemy casualties from a foreign battlefield. These were American civilians who'd been deliberately infected with a biological weapon by their own government, and the people questioning me saw them as nothing more than test subjects. But while I answered their questions with carefully measured cooperation, I was actually gathering intelligence about their operation. Every detail they revealed about their research methodology, every slip they made about timeline and deployment schedules, every assumption they expressed about civilian response patterns, was information I could use against them. I learned that the Virginia outbreak had been conducted using a modified strain of the pathogen that was designed to burn out after 72 hours, preventing uncontrolled spread while still providing realistic test data. The version they were planning to deploy in major cities would have no such limitations. It would continue spreading until it had consumed entire metropolitan populations, creating permanent dead zones that could never be reclaimed. I learned that they'd been conducting similar tests in rural areas across the country for the past 6 months, refining their deployment methods and studying population response patterns. The Virginia test was just the largest and most comprehensive evaluation they'd conducted so far, chosen specifically because it would allow them to study the behavior of intelligence operatives under biological warfare conditions. Most importantly, I learned that Phase 2 implementation was scheduled to begin in less than 18 hours, with simultaneous deployments in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, Philadelphia, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, San Jose, Austin, and Jacksonville. They expected to achieve complete population saturation in all 12 cities within 96 hours of initial deployment. 24 million people were going to die to test whether Meridian Solutions' biological weapon could effectively disable major population centers. But they also revealed something they probably didn't intend to share. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the lead researcher I'd identified from the classified files, was personally overseeing Phase 2 implementation from a facility in rural Virginia, approximately 60 miles west of our current location. She was the only person with the authority and access codes necessary to abort the deployment if something went wrong with their operational timeline. That information gave me a target and a mission. If I could reach Dr. Kane's facility and convince her to abort Phase 2, or if I could expose the conspiracy in a way that forced government intervention, I might be able to prevent the nationwide deployment. But getting there would require escaping from 3 trained operatives who were watching my every move and traveling through territory that was still contaminated with their biological weapon. The opportunity came when Tom received an encrypted communication requiring immediate response. He stepped away from our group to coordinate with his supervisors, leaving Janet and Lisa to continue monitoring me. But their attention was divided between watching me and listening to Tom's conversation, which suggested that whatever he was discussing was significant enough to change their operational priorities. I used their momentary distraction to access the data drive I'd retrieved from Sarah's hiding place, using a portable tablet I'd taken from the shopping center to quickly review the intelligence she'd gathered about Meridian Solutions research program. What I found confirmed everything I'd suspected about the scope of their conspiracy, but it also provided information that could potentially stop their operation. Sarah had identified the location of Dr. Kane's research facility and documented the security protocols that protected it. More importantly, she discovered that the facility contained a centralized control system that could override pathogen deployments across multiple locations simultaneously. If I could access that system, I might be able to prevent Phase 2 implementation even if I couldn't convince Dr. Kane to cooperate voluntarily. But the drive also contained information that made blood run cold. Sarah had discovered that Meridian Solutions was working under contract for a classified government program called Operation Clean Slate, which was designed to test biological warfare capabilities against American populations in preparation for deployment against enemy nations. The Virginia outbreak wasn't just a weapons test. It was practice for using biological weapons as instruments of American foreign policy. The people responsible for this weren't rogue defense contractors operating outside government oversight. They were implementing official policy that had been approved at the highest levels of the national security establishment, which meant that exposing the conspiracy wouldn't be enough to stop them. I needed to prevent Phase 2 implementation directly because the people with the authority to stop it were the same people who'd authorized it in the first place. Tom finished his communication and returned to our group with news that changed everything about our situation. "We've received orders to proceed directly to the primary research facility," he announced. "Dr. Kane wants to conduct a personal debriefing with our test subject before finalizing Phase 2 implementation." He was talking about me. They were taking me directly to the facility where I needed to go, but they were doing it because Dr. Kane wanted to evaluate my psychological state and survival strategies before deploying her weapon against major American cities. I would be delivering myself into the heart of their operation, but I'd also be positioned exactly where I needed to be to potentially stop them. The drive to Dr. Kane's facility took us through areas of Virginia that had been completely evacuated during the biological weapons testing. We passed through towns that were eerily silent, their streets littered with abandoned vehicles and personal belongings that people had dropped while fleeing the advancing infection. The scope of devastation was staggering, but Tom, Janet, and Lisa discussed it with the same clinical detachment they'd shown during my debriefing. They talked about evacuation efficiency rates, population compliance with emergency directives, and infrastructure degradation patterns as if they were reviewing the results of a traffic study rather than the destruction of entire communities. Their complete disconnection from the human cost of their operation made me understand that I was dealing with people who'd been conditioned to see American civilians as acceptable casualties in their pursuit of military superiority. The research facility was hidden in plain sight, disguised as an agricultural research station operated by the Department of Agriculture. The security was extensive but subtle, with multiple checkpoints designed to look like routine agricultural inspection stations. Anyone approaching the facility without proper authorization would be turned away long before they got close enough to identify its true purpose. But as we passed through the security perimeter, I was gathering intelligence about defensive positions, communication systems, and potential escape routes that I might need if my attempt to stop Phase 2 implementation went wrong. The facility was designed to withstand external attack, but the security measures were focused on preventing people from getting in rather than preventing them from getting out. Dr. Elizabeth Kane was waiting for us in what appeared to be a standard conference room, but the equipment visible through adjoining windows revealed the true nature of the facility. I could see laboratories equipped for biological weapons research, computer systems running pathogen deployment simulations, and communication equipment that could coordinate operations across multiple locations simultaneously. Dr. Kane herself was smaller than I'd expected, a woman in her 50s with the kind of calm, professional demeanor that suggested years of experience managing classified research programs. But when she looked at me, I saw the same clinical detachment I'd noticed in Tom, Janet, and Lisa. To her, I wasn't a human being with thoughts and feelings and a life that mattered. I was a data point in her research program. Mr. Vaughn, she sighed, welcoming me like she'd been expecting me all along. Did you really think your Moscow mission was about arms dealing? You've been working for us for 3 years. The casual way she revealed the truth about my assignment confirmed everything I'd suspected about the scope of their manipulation. My entire career with the CIA had been orchestrated to position me exactly where they needed me to be for their biological weapons testing. Every mission, every assignment, every moment of risk I'd accepted in service to my country had actually been in service to people who were planning to use weapons of mass destruction against American citizens. Your intelligence background and survival training made you the perfect test subject for evaluating civilian response patterns under biological warfare conditions. She continued, we needed to understand how trained operatives would react to pathogen deployment, what strategies they would develop for avoiding infection, and how effectively they could organize resistance against our countermeasures. She gestured toward a wall of monitors displaying real-time data from the Virginia outbreak zone. Population movement patterns, infection spread rates, survival strategy effectiveness, resistance organization attempts, all of it reduced to graphs and statistics that could be analyzed for operational improvement. Every decision you made during the past 72 hours has provided valuable intelligence for refining our deployment protocols. Your observations about infected behavior patterns will help us optimize pathogen characteristics for maximum effectiveness. Your survival strategies will help us identify and eliminate potential resistance methods before Phase 2 implementation. Dr. Kane moved to a different set of monitors showing deployment preparations in the 12 target cities. I could see teams positioning equipment, contamination vectors being prepared, and countdown timers showing less than 12 hours until synchronized release. But we have one final test to conduct before we proceed with nationwide deployment, she said, turning back to face me directly. We need to evaluate the psychological breaking point of trained operatives when they're forced to choose between personal survival and loyalty to civilian populations. She nodded to Tom, who produced a tablet showing live surveillance footage from the Virginia outbreak zone. On the screen, I could see a group of survivors who'd managed to establish a secure position in what looked like a reinforced school building. There were maybe 20 people, including children, who'd somehow avoided infection and were trying to wait for rescue that was never going to come. Those people represent uncontrolled variables in our test environment, Dr. Kane explained. They've developed survival strategies that weren't anticipated in our modeling, and their continued resistance is providing other survivors with hope that effective countermeasures are possible. She manipulated the tablet controls, and I watched. Drone footage showing infected being deliberately directed toward the school building by people in hazmat suits. The survivors inside had no idea that their position was about to be overrun by a coordinated attack designed to eliminate their resistance. Your choice is simple, Mr. Vaughn. You can provide us with the intelligence we need to improve our pathogen deployment protocols, including detailed information about the survival strategies you observed and the defensive positions you identified during your escape from the outbreak zone. In exchange, we'll abort the attack on those survivors and allow them to be evacuated safely. She paused to let the implications sink in, watching my face for signs of how I was processing the choice she was offering me. Or you can refuse to cooperate, in which case those 20 people will die horribly while you watch, and we'll proceed with Phase 2 implementation using the intelligence we've already gathered. Either way, our research program will continue. But your cooperation will determine whether those particular civilians live or die. The choice she was offering wasn't really a choice at all. She was threatening to murder innocent people unless I helped her perfect the biological weapon she was planning to deploy against millions of other innocent people. Cooperating would save 20 lives but doom 24 million others. Refusing would condemn the survivors in the school but might preserve my ability to stop the nationwide deployment. But Dr. Kane had made one critical error in her psychological manipulation. She'd revealed that the facility contained the centralized control systems for Phase 2 implementation, and she'd brought me directly into the heart of her operation, where I could potentially access those systems. She thought she was breaking my resistance by forcing me to choose between immediate moral compromise and long-term strategic objectives. Instead, she was providing me with the opportunity I needed to stop her entire program. I agreed to provide the intelligence she wanted, knowing that cooperation would give me access to the facility's systems while maintaining the pretense that I'd been psychologically broken by her threats. But I was also planning something she wouldn't expect from a defeated test subject. I was going to use her own security protocols against her, access the centralized control system she'd revealed, and make sure that Phase 2 implementation never happened. The real question wasn't whether I could stop the deployment. The real question was whether I could do it before those 20 survivors in the school building were overrun by the attack she'd ordered to test my loyalty. Because saving them was just as important as saving the 24 million people in the target cities. They were all American citizens who deserved protection from their own government's biological weapons program, and I wasn't going to let Dr. Kane use any of them as leverage to perfect her instrument of mass murder. The countdown to Phase 2 implementation showed 11 hours and 47 minutes remaining. I had less than 12 hours to stop the deployment, save the survivors in the school, and expose the conspiracy that had corrupted my own intelligence agency. But first, I needed to convince Dr. Kane that I was completely under her control, while actually preparing to destroy everything she'd worked to build. The intelligence briefing I provided to Dr. Kane was carefully crafted to give her useful but incomplete information while concealing the most critical details about survival strategies and resistance capabilities. I described the infected's behavioral patterns and coordination methods, but I emphasized their limitations rather than their adaptive capabilities. I detailed the defensive positions I'd observed, but I focused on the ones that had failed rather than the ones that had proven effective. Throughout the briefing, I was memorizing the facility's layout, identifying security protocols, and locating the centralized control systems that Dr. Kane had revealed during her psychological manipulation attempt. The facility was larger than it appeared from the outside, with multiple levels of underground laboratories and communication centers that coordinated biological weapons, research across dozens of locations. Dr. Kane seemed satisfied with the intelligence I was providing, but she was also monitoring my psychological state for signs of deception or resistance. Janet, who'd revealed herself as Dr. Janet Morrison from the CDC, was taking detailed notes about my responses and occasionally asking follow-up questions designed to test the consistency of my information. But what they didn't realize was that I was also gathering intelligence about their operation that went far beyond what Sarah had been able to document. I learned that Operation Clean Slate involved not just Meridian Solutions, but multiple defense contractors working under classified government authorization. I learned that they'd been conducting biological weapons tests in rural communities across the country for over 2 years, refining their deployment methods and studying population response patterns. Most critically, I learned that Phase 2 implementation was just the beginning of a much larger program. The 12-city deployment was designed to test their ability to disable major population centers simultaneously, but it was also intended to create the political crisis necessary to justify expanded biological weapons programs and increased defense spending for countermeasure development. They were planning to attack American cities with biological weapons, then use the resulting catastrophe to argue for bigger budgets and broader authorities for the same agencies that had conducted the attack. It was a strategy that turned American civilians into expendable assets in a bureaucratic power grab disguised as national security research. Dr. Kane finished reviewing my intelligence reports and seemed pleased with what I'd provided, but she had one final test before she would consider my cooperation complete. The centralized control system for Phase 2 implementation requires biometric authorization from 2 senior researchers, she explained, leading me toward a heavily secured section of the facility. Dr. Morrison will provide one authorization, and I'll provide the other. But we want you to witness the deployment process so you can document the effectiveness of our improvements based on the intelligence you've provided. She was asking me to watch while they deployed biological weapons against 12 American cities, knowing that my observations would help them refine their methods for future attacks. The psychological pressure was designed to complete my breakdown by forcing me to become an active participant in mass murder while maintaining the illusion that I was just providing technical expertise. But what Dr. Kane didn't understand was that witnessing the deployment process would give me access to the same centralized control system she'd described. If I could find a way to override their authorization protocols, I might be able to abort the deployment even after it had been initiated. The control center was a technological marvel, with real-time surveillance feeds from all 12 target cities, deployment coordination systems that could synchronize releases across multiple time zones, and monitoring equipment that would track pathogen spread rates as the attacks progressed. The countdown showed less than 6 hours until deployment, with teams already in position and contamination, equipment ready for activation. Dr. Kane and Dr. Morrison began the authorization sequence, using biometric scanners that required both their fingerprints and retinal patterns to unlock the deployment controls. But as they worked through the security protocols, I noticed something that gave me hope for stopping their operation. The system had been designed with emergency override capabilities that could abort the deployment if testing revealed unexpected problems with pathogen behavior, or deployment effectiveness. The override required access to Sarah's research data, which I had stored on the drive she'd hidden for me, combined with authorization codes that were displayed on the control room monitors during the deployment sequence. I waited until both Dr. Kane and Dr. Morrison were focused on finalizing their preparations, then connected Sarah's data drive to a terminal that was supposed to be used for monitoring deployment progress. The system immediately recognized the drive's contents as legitimate research data and began processing the information Sarah had gathered about Meridian Solutions' biological weapons program. But accessing the override controls required more than just Sarah's data. It required proof that the deployment posed unacceptable risks to national security, which meant I needed to expose the full scope of Operation Clean Slate and document the government's involvement in attacking American civilians. That's when I made the decision that would either save millions of lives or get me killed in the next few minutes. I activated the facility's internal communication system and began broadcasting everything I'd learned about the biological weapons, programmed to every government agency, news organization, and foreign intelligence service in my contact database. The classified files I'd accessed, the security footage from the shopping center, the personnel records linking Meridian Solutions to government officials, everything that proved this was an authorized attack against American citizens. Dr. Kane realized what I was doing within seconds, but by then it was too late to stop the transmission. The information was already spreading through communication networks faster than they could contain it, and the political implications were catastrophic for everyone involved in Operation Clean Slate. "You have no idea what you've just done," she said, her calm professional demeanor finally cracking to reveal the rage underneath. "Those cities are going to be attacked whether we control the deployment or not. Foreign intelligence services have been monitoring our research, and now that you've revealed our capabilities, they'll accelerate their own biological weapons programs." She moved toward the deployment controls, trying to activate Phase 2 implementation before the political fallout could force government officials to abort the operation. But I was already accessing the override system, using Sarah's research data combined with the authorization codes that were displayed on the control monitors. "The pathogen will spread beyond the target cities," I warned, reading from Sarah's analysis of uncontrolled deployment scenarios. "Your 72-hour burnout protocol only works under laboratory conditions. In real-world environments with multiple infection vectors, the pathogen will continue spreading until it consumes the entire eastern seaboard." Dr. Morrison stopped working on the deployment controls and looked at Dr. Kane with something approaching panic. "Elizabeth, if he's right about the spread patterns, we could be looking at 60 million casualties instead of 24 million. That's beyond anything we've modeled." But Dr. Kane was committed to proceeding with the deployment regardless of the consequences. "The research must continue," she insisted. "American biological weapons superiority depends on completing this test phase, regardless of the immediate casualties." That's when I understood that she wasn't just conducting weapons research. She was conducting genocide, using American citizens as test subjects in a program designed to perfect instruments of mass murder for deployment against foreign populations. I activated the override sequence, using Sarah's data to authenticate my authority to abort Phase 2 implementation. The system accepted my credentials and began shutting down deployment operations in all 12 target cities. But Dr. Kane was simultaneously trying to override my override, using emergency protocols that could bypass the normal authorization requirements. The next 60 seconds became a technological battle for control of biological weapons that could kill millions of people, with both of us frantically working through security protocols that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of situation we were creating. Tom, Janet, and Lisa had been watching our confrontation with professional detachment, but as the scope of what was happening became clear, They started taking sides based on their own assessment of which outcome served their operational objectives. Tom moved to support Dr. Kane, using his NSA access codes to help her bypass the override sequence I'd initiated. But Janet surprised everyone by supporting my attempt to abort the deployment, using her CDC credentials to lock out Tom's access and prevent him from completing his authorization. Lisa remained neutral, documenting the entire confrontation for what I assumed was some kind of after-action analysis that would be used to improve security protocols for future operations. The control system was designed to prevent conflicting authorizations from creating operational chaos, but it hadn't been programmed to handle a situation where senior researchers were actively working against each other during a deployment sequence. The result was a cascade of security alerts and system failures that threatened to trigger automatic deployment as a failsafe against unauthorized interference. I realized that neither Dr. Kane nor I was going to be able to completely control the system, which meant I needed to find a different way to prevent the biological weapons from being deployed against American cities. The facility's emergency destruction protocol was designed to eliminate all research materials and equipment if the installation was in danger of being captured or compromised. It wasn't intended to be used during active operations, but it would definitely abort Phase 2 implementation by destroying the centralized control systems that coordinated deployment across multiple locations. Activating the destruction protocol would also destroy all the evidence I'd gathered about Operation Clean Slate and eliminate any possibility of holding the people responsible accountable for their crimes. But it would save 24 million American lives, which was more important than ensuring justice for the people who'd tried to murder them. I accessed the emergency destruction system using credentials I'd memorized from Sarah's research data, but activating it required confirmation that the facility was actually under attack or in imminent danger of compromise. The system wasn't designed to accept political considerations or moral objections as valid reasons for destroying classified research programs. That's when the facility's perimeter alarms began sounding, indicating that we were under attack by unknown forces who'd breached the outer security perimeter. Through the control room surveillance monitors, I could see federal tactical teams moving through the facility's defensive positions, using equipment and tactics that suggested they were either FBI or military assets conducting a raid rather than a rescue operation. They weren't there to help me stop the biological weapons deployment. They were there to secure the facility and eliminate anyone who might have access to classified information about Operation Clean Slate. Dr. Kane smiled when she saw the tactical teams approaching the control center. Did you really think exposing the program would stop it? The people you sent that information to are the same people who authorized Operation Clean Slate in the first place. They're here to eliminate loose ends, not to prevent the deployment. The tactical teams were moving systematically through the facility, and based on their movement patterns, they were preparing to eliminate everyone in the control center, regardless of their role in the biological weapons program. Tom, Janet, Lisa, Dr. Morrison, Dr. Kane, and I were all potential security threats who knew too much about classified operations to be allowed to survive. I had maybe 3 minutes before they breached the control center, and I was the only person in the room who had both the access and the motivation to prevent Phase 2 implementation. But stopping the deployment would require sacrificing my own chance of escape, because activating the emergency destruction protocol would trap me in the facility when the tactical teams arrived. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. 24 million American lives were more important than my survival, and ensuring that biological weapons could never again be deployed against civilian populations was worth any personal cost. I activated the emergency destruction protocol, using Sarah's credentials combined with the tactical team breach as justification for eliminating the facility and all its contents. The system accepted my authorization and began a 60-second countdown to total destruction of all research materials, equipment, and communication systems. Dr. Kane tried to abort the destruction sequence, but it was too late. The protocol had been designed to be irreversible once initiated, specifically to prevent enemy agents from stopping it if they'd managed to infiltrate the facility. 60 seconds, I announced to everyone in the control center. That's how long you have to get clear of the facility before everything here is incinerated. Tom and Lisa immediately headed for the exits, abandoning their operational objectives in favor of personal survival. Janet looked uncertain, torn between her duty to protect classified research and her instinct to preserve her own life. Dr. Morrison was frozen with indecision, unable to process that years of biological weapons research were about to be destroyed. But Dr. Kane remained at the control station, frantically trying to complete Phase 2 implementation before the destruction. Protocol eliminated her ability to deploy the biological weapons. She was willing to die rather than accept that her program was being terminated. 40 seconds, I continued, watching the countdown while monitoring the deployment status for all 12 target cities. Most of the contamination equipment had been successfully shut down, but Dr. Kane had managed to initiate deployment in 2 locations before I'd gained control of the override systems. New York and Los Angeles were about to be attacked with biological weapons, and there was nothing I could do to stop those specific deployments from the facility that was about to be destroyed. 20 seconds. Dr. Morrison finally broke free from her paralysis and ran for the exit, leaving only Dr. Kane and myself in the control center. She was still working desperately to expand the deployment beyond the 2 cities she'd managed to activate, while I was trying to send emergency warnings to authorities in New York and Los Angeles about the imminent biological weapons attacks. 10 seconds. Dr. Kane looked up from the control station and fixed me with a stare that contained more hatred than I'd ever seen in another human being. "You have no idea what you've done to this country's national security," she said. "Foreign enemies will develop their own biological weapons programs, and when they attack us, the blood will be on your hands." 5 seconds. I met her stare and felt completely at peace with the choice I'd made. The blood of 24 million innocent Americans would have been on yours. The emergency destruction protocol activated at exactly 11:47 in the evening on October 17th, 2024. The facility and everything in it was incinerated within minutes, eliminating decades of biological weapons research and ensuring that Operation Clean Slate could never be attempted again. But the program had already claimed thousands of lives in Virginia, and the 2 deployments Dr. Kane had managed to activate in New York and Los Angeles would kill thousands more before emergency response teams could contain the outbreaks. I escaped the facility during the chaos of the destruction sequence, but the tactical teams that had been sent to eliminate witnesses were still hunting for survivors who might have access to classified information. I spent the next 18 hours evading federal agents while trying to reach authorities who could respond to the biological weapons attacks in New York and Los Angeles. The official story blamed the incidents on terrorist attacks using stolen research materials, but the evidence I'd transmitted before destroying the facility eventually reached people who were willing to investigate the truth about Operation Clean Slate. The political fallout was enormous, though most of it happened behind closed doors where the public would never learn about it. Dr. Elizabeth Kane died in the facility destruction, along with most of the research that would have enabled future biological weapons programs. Tom, Janet, and Lisa survived the evacuation, but they were reassigned to classified positions where they could be monitored and controlled by people who wanted to ensure their silence about what they'd witnessed. Sarah Chun was never found, and I still don't know whether she survived her attempt to expose the conspiracy or whether she was eliminated by the same people who'd authorized Operation Clean Slate, the pathogen outbreaks in Virginia, New York, and Los Angeles were contained within 96 hours, but not before claiming over 20,000 American lives. The survivors in the school building I'd seen on Dr. Kane's monitors were successfully evacuated, though I never learned whether that was because of my actions or because the tactical situation had changed after I'd destroyed the facility. The official casualty count was classified, and the families of the victims were told that their loved ones had died in industrial accidents or terrorist attacks rather than in biological weapons tests conducted by their own government. I'm telling you this story because the people responsible for Operation Clean Slate are still out there. Meridian Solutions is still operating under different names and different contracts. The government officials who authorized biological weapons testing against American civilians are still in positions of authority where they can approve similar programs. Most importantly, the research that Dr. Kane and her team were conducting wasn't unique to the United States. Foreign governments have been developing their own biological weapons programs, and some of them have undoubtedly made progress that matches or exceeds what was accomplished in the Virginia facility. The first 72 hours taught me that the real enemy isn't always the monster trying to hurt you. Sometimes it's the people who created the monster in the first place, and sometimes those people are the ones who claim they're trying to protect you. What happened in Virginia was just the beginning. The technology exists, the research continues, and the political will to use biological weapons against civilian populations has been demonstrated at the highest levels of government. The next outbreak might not be a test. It might not have built-in limitations or override protocols. It might not be stopped by someone who happens to be in the right place at the right time with access to the right information. Stay vigilant. Trust your instincts. Question official explanations that seem too convenient or too simple. And remember that when someone tells you they're from the government and they're here to help, you should ask yourself whether they're here to help you or to help themselves. Because the people who deployed biological weapons against American civilians in Virginia are still out there, and they're still convinced that their research is more important than the lives of the people they're experimenting on. What I discovered in those files Sarah died to give me proved that Virginia was just the beginning. The real scope of their program, the international connections, the plans for future deployments, all of it points to something much larger than what happened during those first 72 hours. But that's a story for another time, because the people who are still hunting me would prefer that you never learn about what they're planning next. Just remember that sometimes surviving the first crisis is just the price of admission to something much worse.